In this video, I'm going to be making the world's fastest late 2008 13-inch aluminum unibody MacBook. Now, this is actually not my machine. This was actually sent to me by Greg Rutke of Rutke Mods, and I'm actually going to be performing this modification for him. So this is, of course, his machine, like I said, so I'm going to be upgrading the CPU on this machine and then sending it back to him. So if you want to go ahead and check out his YouTube channel, I will put a link to it in the video description. Now, as I mentioned, what I'm going to be doing in this video is I'm going to be upgrading the CPU on this MacBook to a 3.06 GHz Core 2 Duo T9900 CPU. Now, for those of you who don't know, the T9900 is the absolute best CPU that you can install on one of these MCP79 chipset-based machines. So if I go into the SATA here, you can see that this machine is indeed running off the NVIDIA MCP79 chipset, and of course that has the NVIDIA GeForce 9400M integrated graphics on board. So yeah, what I'm going to be doing is first I'm going to be running a Geekbench on this machine as the base configuration, or while it's still in the base configuration, and that way we can get a base reading to see what we're trying to improve from. So I've gone ahead and gotten Geekbench open here, as you can see. So we'll go ahead and begin running the CPU benchmark. So once this completes, this will give us a base reading using the 2 GHz stock Core 2 Duo P7450. I believe is what that is. It might be P7400. I'm not 100% sure. But once I get the logic board out of the machine, we'll check that and see what the stock CPU is. But it is a 2 GHz Core 2 Duo T9 or P7450 or 7400, and I believe it has 4 megabytes of L2 cache. The T9900 is a 3.06 GHz CPU with 6 megabytes of L2 cache, and while it does run quite a bit hotter, of course, it is a much faster processor and should increase the usability and speed of this machine by a long shot. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the video here, let the Geekbench finish up, and we will take a look at the final score. Alright, as you can see, the Geekbench has finished running, and it gets a single core score of 1422 and a multi-core score of 2390. So that's pretty weak for a Core 2 Duo even. So yeah, this is of course a low power 2 GHz Core 2 Duo. As you can see, it is actually a Core 2 Duo P7350. The P7450 I think is the 2.13 GHz version of the same processor. So now what I'm going to go ahead and do is get our new T9900 CPU off of a donor board, because unfortunately you can't actually get a BGA version of the T9900 outside of getting it off of another board, unfortunately. So I will have to desolder it from another MacBook logic board and reball it in order to solder it onto this board. So actually, Greg Rutke, he purchased a presumably dead 15-inch MacBook Pro logic board that has a T9900 CPU already on it. So I'm going to go ahead and desolder it from that board, reball it, and then solder it onto this one. So I'll go ahead and close out of all this stuff here, shut the system down, and then we will be able to begin the process of soldering or desoldering our target CPU, our donor CPU, I should say. So I'm going to go ahead and get my camera and the tripod at my soldering station, and then we'll begin the process of desoldering the T9900 CPU. Alright, so as you can see, I've got the donor board on our board preheater here. Of course, we will be taking this CPU off, which is a 3.06 GHz T9900, as I mentioned before. So the first thing we need to do is remove the little adhesive things on the edge of the chip. So all we need to do is, of course, when the board is hot, which it is right now, go ahead and take some tweezers and just pull them off like so. These are being a little bit more stubborn than usual. Alright, so now they all look to be off for the most part. So now what we'll go ahead and do is apply some flux to the perimeter of the chip. Alright, now that we've got a nice amount of flux under there, now what we need to do is align the hot air nozzle, and then we'll begin the process of heating up the chip and removing it. Alright, so the hot air nozzle is now aligned, so now I'm going to go ahead and begin removing the chip. Alright, so the chip is now loose from the board. I can move it with my tweezers a little bit under the hot air. That's how I know it's ready to come off. So now we'll go ahead and remove the hot air and pull the chip off. And there we go. So now I'll go ahead and turn that off. And now we'll begin the process of removing the residual solder off of the chip and prepare to reball it. Alright, so as you can see here, I've got the CPU in my reballing jig here. So the first thing I'm going to do is just go ahead and apply a little bit more flux to it. So we got some nice fresh flux. Just like that. And then I'm going to go ahead and apply some fresh solder using my soldering iron to remove all the lead-free solder that's currently on the chip. Alright, and now that all the lead-free solder is off of there, we can now go ahead and start going over it with the solder wick to remove it all. Alright, and there we go. That looks to be pretty darn good. So now I'm going to go ahead and clean the chip off in some rubbing alcohol, and then we'll be able to begin the process of reballing it. So I'll be right back. Alright, so as you can see here, I've gotten the chip perfectly clean. So the next thing we need to do is just apply a little bit of flux to the chip before we apply our stencil. Alright, so that should be about good. And now we'll go ahead and heat it using the hot air just to make it nice and liquid. Alright, so there we go. The flux is nice and liquefied now. So now we'll take a paper towel and wipe it all around the chip just so we have a nice thin layer. Alright, so there we go. We've got a nice thin layer of flux on the chip. So now we are ready to put it in a reballing jig and put the stencil on it. So I'm going to go ahead and get the stencil ready and then go ahead and resume the video. Alright, so I've got the stencil ready along with my little reballing jig here. So the way this works, it kind of uses this spring to push on the bottom of the chip and then holds it onto the stencil. So it's not the best thing to use for this, but it seems to work perfectly fine. So let me get this. There we go. And then go ahead and take our stencil and put it on the correct orientation. Lock it down. And then make sure the solder pads are lined up in the holes. There we go. Alright, so as you can see, the stencil is now lined up just right. So now we can begin the process of applying solder balls. Alright, and then once we get most of the balls in the holes, then we have to use tweezers to align all the rest of the residual balls that didn't go in the holes. Which can be a bit tedious, obviously. Alright, so there we go. We have all the balls in the holes. So now I'm going to go ahead and warm up my hot air station, and then we'll begin the process of heating the solder balls and getting them to melt into their holes and onto the pads. So I'm going to go ahead and let that warm up for just a minute here. Actually, I see one ball I missed. Go. And now we can go ahead and begin heating. Alright, so now that they've started to melt into the holes, I'm going to go ahead and apply some more flux to the top of the stencil here, and that will just get them all to seat down properly where they're supposed to go. Alright, and as you can see, all the balls look nice and shiny, which is exactly how they should look. So now I'm going to let the chip cool down, and once it gets to a cool enough level, we can go ahead and remove it from the reballing jig and take the stencil off. And then from there, we'll go ahead and heat it one more time to make sure all the balls are seated down correctly. So once it cools down here, should be ready to do so. Alright, that looks good. Alright, there we go. The stencil has now been removed. Let's set that to the side. And now that the stencil's been removed, I'm going to go ahead and use the hot air one more time. To just flatten down all the balls. Alright, and there we go. That looks just about good. So now I'm going to go ahead and let this cool down. And now that we've gotten the chip completely reballed, I can go ahead and start disassembling the MacBook to begin the process of removing its CPU. And so we can solder this one on. So I'm going to go ahead and get that MacBook disassembled, and then I'll go ahead and resume the video. Alright, as you can see here, I've gotten the MacBook 5,1 board on my board preheater here. So now we can go ahead and basically do the exact same process we did on the donor board, and that is just remove these adhesive things, put some flux onto the chip, and desolder it. So this board's a little wonky on here. Alright, so all that adhesive is off now, so now we can go ahead and start applying the flux. Alright, and now that the flux is applied, we can go ahead and heat up the board a little bit more, and then we can go ahead and begin the process of desoldering the CPU. Alright, and that actually looks pretty well aligned, so now we'll go ahead and turn the hot air on and begin removing the chip. Alrighty, so the chip is now loose from the board, so now we'll go ahead and move the hot air and take the chip off. And there we go. So go ahead and decrease the temperature there, turn the hot air off, and now what we can go ahead and do is use my soldering iron to remove all the residual solder from the board and prepare the pads to have the new CPU soldered on. And now we'll basically just be repeating the same thing we did before. Alright, and now with the residual solder off, go ahead and use the solder wick to remove the remaining solder. Alright, and now that all that solder is removed, we can go ahead and turn off the board preheater, let that cool down, and then we'll go ahead and clean off all of that old flux off of the board. So, go ahead and put my soldering iron away, and then we're just going to use some rubbing alcohol and paper towels to remove that solder, or that flux. Alright, so now that the flux has all been removed from the board, we're going to go ahead and apply some new flux and prepare to solder the new CPU on. So go ahead and turn the hot air or the board preheater back on here. Go ahead and apply some new flux. Just like that. And then with that applied, go ahead and use a paper towel to remove most of the residual flux, just so we have a nice thin layer where the CPU is going to solder. And that should be just about good there. So now I'm going to go ahead and line up the new CPU. Now this is going to be a little bit more difficult on this board because, as you can tell, there is actually no outline or silkscreen outline where the chip is supposed to go. On the older boards, there is actually a silkscreen outline, but on these newer systems, there are not. So any of these boards, most of the boards that have the black solder mask like this do not have any silkscreen on them for whatever reason. But that does make it quite a bit harder to line up a new chip. But I don't think it should be too bad as long as I eyeball it pretty well. So we'll go ahead and just take it and just kind of plop it on the board here. So we'll start by making sure that it's lined up vertically on here. So I'll do it more this way. Make sure it's lined up horizontally. So the best way we can do that is use the light here and just kind of nudge it up here. You want to make sure that the chip is even on both sides of these pads here. And then, once we make sure that's even, go ahead and kind of push it down like this. And then I can usually eyeball it pretty well by looking under the chip. And seeing when the pads all line up. Alright, so that looks about good right there. So now I'm going to go ahead and just line up the hot air and begin heating and hope it's lined up correctly. That's kind of all you can really do in this type of situation. But I have done so quite a few times, and I've never had any problems. So let's see what we can do here. Of course, first I'm going to make sure the hot air is lined up like it should be. Alright, and that appears to be lined up just right, so now we can go ahead and turn on the hot air and solder the chip on. Alright, and I think that might be soldered on just fine, it looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off the hot air and let the chip cool down. Alright, so as you can see here, the CPU looks to be soldered on just fine. So it's sitting completely flush on the board. If we take a look at the side here, you can kind of see, let me see if I can get it to focus a little bit better. Yep, you can see all the solder balls under there. They look to have soldered in just fine. I'll go ahead and check this side as well. So they're nice and flat, just like they're supposed to be. If we look at it from the corner, you can see it doesn't look to be raised anywhere. It looks to be seated down, completely flush to the board. So now what I'm going to go ahead and do is put the heatsink on, just temporarily of course, so we can go ahead and test it and see if the machine actually starts. And if it does, that means we were successful in the CPU upgrade. And then I'm going to go ahead and put the board in my ultrasonic cleaner, and that'll get all this nasty flux off of it. And after that, we'll dry the board off, and then it's complete. So I'm going to go ahead and get the heatsink on, and from there we'll begin the process of testing the board. So I'll be right back. Alright, so as you can see here, I've gotten the board reinstalled into the system. I haven't screwed most of it in yet, but I have plugged everything in, of course, so we can turn it on and give it a quick test. So as you can see, I've got the heatsink installed. I've got that screwed in, of course. So let me go ahead and put the bottom cover on the system, turn it over, and then we can begin testing it. Alright, let's go ahead and open the system and turn the machine on. And look at that, it is working perfectly. Of course, it does now have the Core 2 Duo T9900 CPU installed. So yep, there is the boot disks. So I'm going to go ahead and start off the internal hard disk. And once this thing finishes booting up, I'm going to go ahead and resume the video. Alright, so as you can see here, the machine has finished booting up. So let's go ahead and take a look at About This Mac. And look at that, there it is. It detects that it has a 3.06 GHz Intel Core 2 Duo installed. Of course, it's got the same 8 GB of system memory, and of course the same video card, because that's on the chipset. So let me go ahead and close that, and let's go ahead and open up Geekbench. That way we can actually check to see what CPU it is, and then we can actually compare it to the previous Geekbench scores that I took with the stock CPU installed. So yep, there it is, Intel Core 2 Duo T9900 running at 3.06 GHz. So everything looks to be detected perfectly. So I'm going to go ahead and start the CPU benchmark here, and I'm going to let this run, and once this completes, I'll go ahead and resume the video and show you the results. Alright, so the Geekbench has just finished running, and as you can see here, it now gets a single core score of 2020 and a multi-core score of 2479. Now I was actually expecting some higher scores, as my mod book with the same CPU upgrade got a up in the 3000s on the multi-core. But I suppose a few more tests and that would probably go up as the I have noticed that the more you utilize Geekbench, the more you run it, the better it gets, at least at first, when doing these CPU upgrades. But yeah, it is definitely a big improvement from the stock CPU, regardless. So here's the stock benchmark that I made before upgrading the CPU. And as you can see here, it gets a single core score of 1422 and a multi-core score of 2390. So the multi-core score didn't go up too much, but the single core score went up quite a bit, almost 500 points, I would say. So that is still a decent improvement, and like I said, I suppose it would eventually get a little bit better than this the more you utilize the system. So yeah, that has been the upgrade of this 13-inch late 2008 aluminum unibody MacBook to a Core 2 Duo T9900 CPU. Hope you enjoyed this video.